Order. Welcome to this meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. Today we're beginning our inquiry into minority languages in the UK. Before we start, do any members have any interest to declare? No, in which case our first panel today is with the broadcasting organisations, and we're joined by John Morrison, the chair of MG Alba. We're joined by Rhodri Talfan Davies, the director of Nations at the BBC, and we're joined by Rhodri Williams, who's the chair of S4C. You're all very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. So at this point, I wanted to acknowledge that Rhodri Williams will be stepping down as the chair of S4C shortly. I know it's been a difficult time for the organisation, Rhodri, and I don't want to focus too much on that today. So before we start talking about minority languages, I wondered if you could, I think it would be helpful for the committee if you could just set out the next steps that S4C are taking to address workplace culture and how that will be taken forward upon your departure.
Yes. Thank you, and thank you for inviting us all here and undertaking this important inquiry. As far as we're concerned, it certainly has been an unprecedentedly difficult year, probably the most difficult year in the whole existence of the service. And following the commissioning of the independent report by the board then took what was decisive action, obviously, to terminate the employment of the chief executive, which led to much comment in the media and beyond. But I'm glad to say that I think we have now moved beyond that, and there are other things that, in the board's view, would need addressing in order to restore confidence in the institution. And I think we need to restore the confidence of our staff, who of course were the cause of the complaints made by the trade union Bectu in the first place. The confidence of our suppliers, most of who we pay for their content, and of course partners such as the BBC, who provide content to us, as well as allowing us access to the iPlayer platform, which is very important. And I think we need to restore confidence more broadly with our stakeholders, with elected representatives, both here at Westminster and in Cardiff Bay. That's something I'm confident that I think we can do. And what we have done, and we've sent a copy of a 15-point action plan to officials, one which we have developed with the help of our staff, with input from Bectu, and in collaboration with officials at DCMS. And that action plan deals with leadership, it deals with culture, it deals with the policies that we currently have in place, and it deals with governance. And hopefully over the coming months, my successor, firstly the interim chair, who will take over on the 1st of April, whose appointment I'm expecting to be announced by DCMS very shortly, along with the board, will implement that plan and get us back into a far better position. And I think what helps us there is firstly the dedication and hard work of our staff and our supply partners, who have actually made sure that during the 9 months of turbulence that occurred last year and early this year, actually, as far as the service was concerned, the ball wasn't dropped on any occasion, and the service continued to function efficiently and well, and was well supported. And also, I think there is a will there beyond S4C itself for that to happen, and for us to move on and to carry on providing what we would describe, and I think what lots of other people who are interested in the preservation of the language and to secure its future, that we can get back to the main task at hand, if you like, rather than dealing with the difficulties that beset us last year.
Okay. Thank you, Rhodri. Well, in which case I'm going to start the questions with you, seeing as you've got the floor at the moment. Do you think minority language broadcasting is part of a broader strategy to support the growth of minority languages?
Absolutely, and I think it's a very important part of that strategy. I'm old enough to have been around matters dealing with the Welsh language and its use and its status and the provision of support for it since the early 70s. And in my view, the establishment of S4C in 1982 was the key moment up until that point in the whole development of the language. It sent a very clear signal to Welsh speakers themselves that there was support there from the UK government for the language. It created sort of an opportunity for people to see the language being used in a dynamic and modern way, and it also created economic opportunities for people to work in what was a highly attractive sector, but to do that in Welsh and to do it in various parts of Wales. They didn't have to do it in Cardiff. They could do it in North Wales, they could do it in West Wales, and that was a hugely significant development as far as the language is concerned. And obviously there had been provision before that, both by what was then HTV, one of the ITV companies, and the BBC, but actually getting a service that was, although at that time only broadcasting for 4 to 5 hours a day, actually to get a comprehensive service which offered a wide range of content across many genres, bringing things like entertainment and drama to the screen in a way which had never been done before. That was a huge moment for the language, and I think since that point we've seen other very significant developments in other areas of language policy to do with the status of the language, the amount of educational opportunities that are now provided for people to study through the medium of Welsh. But that all came about, I think, as a result of the establishment of S4C, which also made a huge difference, I think, to attitudes towards the language. Up until 1982, the Welsh language was the subject of controversy and disagreement in Wales. That came to an end when S4C was. I don't think it was necessarily a deliberate part of the planning for it, but it led to a far more convivial atmosphere where the support for Welsh from people who don't speak the language has grown exponentially since 1982, and that was, I think, a very important development.
Yeah. And can I turn to you? How do you think broadcasting links to education and learning a language from children to adults, assisting the sort of intergenerational transfer of language? What's the sort of view of Alba on that?
It's absolutely key, and I would echo much of what Rhodri said there, that the same applies to Gaelic, although I have to say Wales and Welsh has probably set the gold standard in the UK for minority languages. But for the development of a language that is in facing a crisis, there are two pillars. You've got education and you've got broadcasting, and both work well together. So in Scotland in the 1980s we got Gaelic schools after hundreds of years of Gaelic being effectively legislated against. And so you had get the start of Gaelic schools. There are now 5,000 children go through Gaelic schools who are taught through the medium of Gaelic. Alongside that has grown what MG Alba and BBC Alba do. The BBC used to do children's programmes, they are now shown on BBC. So we do programming for preschool, for school and for older pupils. So this gives the language, when you're developing a minority language, you need three things. You need visibility, which a channel gives it. You need usage, which a channel gives it as well, and encourages usage in the community. And you also reach out to learners. So we are delighted that our Learn Gaelic now reaches 500,000 users, when we have about 70,000 speakers. So that could be massive, and that is something we want to be spending more money on, because this could be transformational for the language. And so we've got jobs created in television, but you've got jobs created alongside in teaching as well. And then you take the fun side, which is something like Celtic Connections in Glasgow, which is a fantastic music festival. Every January brightens the gloom of the winter for many people, including thousands of people who come to Glasgow. And without the Celtic, you wouldn't have the Celtic Connections. So, and a lot of the young people that are performing in fantastic new bands have come through our products of Gaelic Media and Education, and indeed often get their first showing on BBC Alba, because we are the platform.
Very good, thank you very much. Rhodri, Talfan, Davies, did you have anything to add on that question?
No, I mean, I would echo an awful lot of what John and Rhodri said. I think that the role of broadcasting in providing, firstly, a space for a community to speak in its own language, particularly when some of those linguistic heartlands are starting to be diluted in terms of the prevalence of the English language. I think that's critical. It gives a confidence and a status that is incredibly important. I think the other thing I would just add to everything that has been said is that these are not just services that are about the preservation or safeguarding or the promotion of language. They're also just hugely valued in their own rights for the companionship and the enjoyment they give speakers across the UK. I mean, if you take a service like Radio Cymru in Welsh, it's being consumed for about 1 million hours a week. I mean, it's in a huge, it's the most popular language among fluent Welsh speakers. It plays a huge role in linguistic national life. So, yes, of course, there is a public policy dimension to this in terms of safeguarding and promoting linguistic fluency and linguistic confidence. But there is also just the principle of inclusion, which is giving people of different languages a space in which they can share stories in their own medium.
Thank you very much. Alex.
Thank you. John, in your evidence, you said that Gaelic public service media, primarily BBC, Alba, find itself at a crisis point. Why did you say that?
For several reasons, and I'll distill it down to two reasons, because we were set up by the UK government, which set up a Gaelic fund in the 90s, which was worth about £9.5 million. Nowadays, that would be worth £25 million. Unfortunately, MG Alba, which is the successor of that organisation, the outfunding has been frozen now for 10 years. And I'll explain the complexities of the funding, but Rhodri will know the pain that the BBC went through when the licence fee was frozen for 2 years. So we are paid for by Scottish ministers through Ofcom, and that money has been frozen for 10 years, which means that in 2 years' time it'll be worth exactly 50% of the launch budget we had. So really it is unsustainable. Now the other side of it is that the UK government, the various acts that have given us what we have now, have given us a very complex infrastructure whereby we've been legislated for by the UK Parliament, by Westminster, which looks after media law. We're regulated by Ofcom, which is another UK institution, to which Scottish ministers don't need to answer. We're paid for by Scottish ministers through Ofcom, who give us the cash, and then we have a partnership, a very valuable partnership with the BBC. And I have to, at this point, pay credit to the BBC, because last year we had the 100th anniversary of broadcasting in Gaelic. Started off with a sermon from Aberdeen, a religious sermon over 100 years ago, and now we have BBC Alba. So there's been huge progress, which we have been hand in hand with the BBC. Also, the independent companies like STV and Grampian played their role. But right now, having gone quite a long way in terms of establishing BBC Alba. We are effectively being starved of cash because 50%, if this was a private company, you'd be saying you're heading towards insolvency and somebody would be closing you down. And we're not helped by the complexity of the structure. So out of this whole process, I think we need two things. I think we need a simplification of the process with somebody. We're like the orphan child of British broadcasting, where we fall between all these stools and we look up and we say we would need more money, we need more power, we need somebody that we can turn to and say, look, we can't continue like this. And we also need a funding mechanism which gives us assurance that we do have a future.
On that latter point, the UK government has said it will look at funding of minority language broadcasting when it considers the next BBC Charter and through its review of BBC funding. Is that sufficient?
No. And first of all, it's 4 years away. And in 4 years' time, we will be below 50%. So the trajectory is going like that. We'll be below 50%. Also, the BBC Charter will look at many, many things. I suspect that Gaeilge will be a tiny little part of that. So we are looking to this committee, this Parliament, this government to help us out. And the other thing with MG Alba, despite the partnership we have with BBC, a very fruitful partnership, we don't fall within the terms of the BBC Charter. And so when we say, the bill at the moment says that Ofcom decides what is sufficient, but if Ofcom decides one day actually what you're getting from the BBC, what the BBC is paying for, so the BBC gives £10 million in people programmes and access to the iPlayer, and the Scottish Government gives us 13 million, which has stayed at 13 for 10 years. So if Ofcom were to say there is not sufficient broadcasting, who would they go to say you're responsible for doing this? Who would pay for that? Who would be responsible for making the people who would pay for it pay for it? So we're caught in this dilemma where nobody seems to have ultimate power, and as a result we have nobody we can turn to. Despite that, we have huge cultural impact. We have also created, MG Alba has created 320 jobs since we started off, and we are bringing in, we peaked at 700,000 viewers. The high point, I would say the average high point was about 500,000 for a language of 70,000. We're now down to 300,000 because of linear dropping off, and we have been given no cash to actually help in the transition to digital. So we're really, really struggling. So I don't think crisis is too strong a word. So we need these two things to put things right.
What does a sustainable funding model look like for you, and what difference would it make to broadcasting?
Well, I like that figure of 25 million, because if you took 9.5, which was our real, it was like a bolt from the blue. It was a huge impetus into the language, into television, into jobs, into creation. And this has had cross-party support. The Labour Lib Dem coalition passed the Gaeilge Act early in the 2000s. The SNP have always been extremely supportive and are bringing forward a Gaeilge, Scottish Languages Act at the moment. So sustainability for us, if you took that 9.5 million projected forwards 25 million, we also asked EY, or Ernst & Young in the old title, to have a look at our finances, just to say, what are we doing? Look at our governance. Is there stuff we could do better? And they think we're doing an incredible job at stretching the money as far as we do. And they also said that if you took that 13 million and applied inflation to it over the decade, we'd be at around 25 million. So that'd be 25 million for MG Alba, and then the BBC contribution. And obviously, BBC's done a lot for us, Rhodri, and we love you dearly. But you know, we look at the figures, and you know, we'd like more, obviously.
So Rhodri, we've heard John's side of the story. So from your perspective, how is the BBC working with John's organisation to support its funding long term?
Well, in my experience, I think the partnership works brilliantly. I think that there is a shared ambition. I think there is a set of shared values that drive the commissioning and the programming decisions. I think that we are collectively thinking hard about this transition to digital. I think in the conversations that we're having with MG Alba, we're thinking about how we can give the language greater prominence and salience on our digital platforms. We're thinking about how a higher impact content can play a bigger part in the channel, because, I mean, if you look at some of the successes that S4C has enjoyed over the last 5 or 10 years, they've not just resonated within the Welsh language community, they've resonated internationally, and I know MG Alba and my colleagues at BBC Scotland have that same ambition. So I think the partnership is good. I think what John says in terms of money, that is a shared challenge across the broadcasting ecology, that there is no doubt that the financial constraints facing public service broadcasting are acute. And you'll have had my own boss, Tim Davies, here telling you about the challenges on the licence fee. So, yes, we all share an ambition, ideally, to do more and to do it better and to drive digital migration. But there's a real politique here in terms of the available resource, and that pressure is becoming more acute for everybody.
Do you agree with John's analysis in terms of his funding issues? Does the BBC share that?
I don't think I'm going to wade into a conversation about Scottish Government support for the language. I mean, the BBC is... Well, the BBC clearly has supported Gaelic for many decades through Radio Nan Gaeilge. We were delighted in 2008, I believe,
That's right,
to join forces with MG Alba to create the new broadcast channel. But I think a bit like S4C in terms of how its own funding is determined by the UK government, I think those are matters for MG Alba and S4C respectively, not for the BBC.
Nice try, Alex.
Thank you very much, and thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. I think it would be good for us just to go back to basics here, because looking around the committee, I think I'm the only person who comes from a Gaelic-speaking family, and a Scots-speaking family, and a Northern-speaking family on the Nicholson side from Orkney, and yet here I am speaking only basic English. So I'd like to pick up on something that you said, John, where you said that Gaelic was legislated against. I think it'd be very useful for you to let us know what happened to Gaelic, because people didn't decide spontaneously one day to stop speaking, did they? I mean, once upon a time, you would have had 1 million or more people speaking Gaelic all across central and northern Scotland, the southwest, Ayrshire. This was a language that was on equal par with Scots, was it not? And so its decline, a bit like the glens where it prospered, wasn't natural. There was deforestation of a people, a land, and also the beautiful places that they lived in.
It was indeed, and you've just got to travel through Scotland all the way from Galloway, Dumfries and Galloway, through the Highlands across to Aberdeenshire to see Gaelic in the place names. You'll see it in the names of the mountains, the rivers, the lochs, the people. But I'll go back probably to Culloden and the Jacobite Rising. Now, there's a lot of mythology around that. This wasn't a Scotland versus England battle. There were Gaelic speakers on both sides of that battle, but despite that, the repercussions against Gaelic speakers and the Gaelic-speaking clans was brutal, and the kilt was banned, the bagpipe was banned, Gaelic speaking was pushed down sort of under the radar as well. So that was post-Culloden. Then you moved into 100 years of clearances, where tens of thousands of people were forcibly removed from the Highlands and Islands. And, you know, I would say that probably 100% of them would have been Gaelic speakers. They were scattered all over the world. Some pockets like Nova Scotia have retained the language, which is quite amazing. Then we had a critical change in 1872 because you had the Education Act in Scotland that made the education of children between 5 and 13 compulsory. There was no place for Gaelic within that Education Act. So basically, Gaelic was pushed out of the classroom, it was pushed out of people's lives, and if you spool forward to my parents' generation, which I think you mentioned previously, they were actually punished. They were belted if they spoke Gaelic in the classroom. When I went to school, I didn't speak any English. And from day one, the Gaelic-speaking teacher said to me, "From today, John, you will be speaking English." And I remember thinking, "Oh, right, this is going to be a challenge." So my first sentence, I won't even repeat it, was a wee bit tricky. But now, thankfully, things have changed. The 1980s saw the opening of the first Gaelic schools. 1990s saw this £9.5 million given to Gaelic broadcasting. So you've had Conservatives backing it, you've had the Labour Lib Dem coalition backing it, you've got the SNP backing it. There's now dozens of schools across the country. There's 5,000 young people going through. You've got the likes of, for example, does this hold them back? To add to the point, no, it doesn't, because you've got Scoil Gaelic Wasco in Glasgow, which is annually, they're amongst the top performing state school in Scotland.
We're going to be visiting, and we're also going to be visiting the island of Harris, which is where my father's family come from, and we'll be seeing language alive there, which is very important. But we've heard from Rhodri the effect that S4C had, and I think he would say in effect it saved the language. A previous committee, our predecessor committee, recommended in its report that Gaelic broadcasting was given parity with Welsh in terms of percentage funding. Our recommendation wasn't picked up, sadly. What effect would that have if we were just, not to give you an advantage, but just to give you parity with Welsh? What effect would that have?
I think what we're looking for Gaelic is parity of esteem. When we look, and Rhodri, I have to say, when we do look south, we look very, very enviously south, because the budgets for S4C, what is it, 90 million plus 25 million pounds. But the most important thing, though, is there is a structure by which the Welsh broadcasters know how much money they're going to get. We don't have that. So what we're looking for is parity of esteem in broadcasting. And I think, if we looked in terms of, I hate to kind of pull out figures, we're not looking for the same budgets in case there are people who are terrified that we are going to be looking, like Rhodri beside me, that we're looking for tens of millions. I think if we got £25 million plus a funding mechanism that secured that going forward, and if we got something in the bill that said there is a Gaelic service going forward that protects the right of this language to exist and to broadcast and tell our stories to the world.
Well, you've made that point loudly and clearly, and I think it's important as well that you explain to the committee that Gaelic was deliberately attacked over generations, and my grandmother, who didn't speak a word of English when she went to school, she was beaten in the playground by Gaelic-speaking teachers for speaking Gaelic. I mean, the self-loathing was extraordinary, and I know the Welsh had an equivalent with the Welsh Not. John, thank you for the moment. Rhodri, we're going to be talking about Rhodri in the middle. We're going to be talking about Scots at the next session as well. Everybody knows what Gaelic is. Some people struggle a wee bit with Scots. I mean, you hear ill-informed comments saying that it's slang or it's a dialect of English, and of course this is illiterate nonsense. But Gaelic has an advantage in a way, doesn't it? Because it's so different, and it has respect because it's used to broadcast news and current affairs. Why don't you broadcast news and current affairs in Scots?
Well, I think it perhaps goes back to a question of why wouldn't the provision be the same in all languages, in all minority languages? And I think that if you look at the span of the last 100 years of broadcasting, the development of language broadcasting in different parts of the UK has evolved in different times. And I suspect in the run-up to Charter and beyond, that broadcasting in minority languages will continue to evolve and flex. I mean, if there were a clear audience demand and that was deemed to be a good thing to do, that's something...
You asked them.
Well, I think that the truth is, and I think you've touched on it, is that the position of Scots in Scotland is very different to the position of Gaelic. Partly, I suspect, because it's regarded as a sister language to English in terms of its derivation. Partly, there are many variants of Scots.
Many variants of Gaelic. There's dialects of Gaelic all around the country. There's 10 times more people speak Scots than speak Gaelic, and you provide for Gaelic. We provide for Gaelic collectively, not enough, but we do. But the thing about Scots is that Scots has either been relegated or promoted, depending on your point of view, to just the cultural sphere, doesn't it? So you've got plays in Scots, you've got music in Scots. But one of the things that Scots doesn't have is that kind of acknowledgement of it as an authority language. So you don't have a news presenter reading the news in Scots. You don't have reporters reporting from Parliament in Scots. It's all about music and culture, which is great. But there's something, isn't there, about having a language that's used to report government business that gives it a certain status, and you don't have that.
No, we don't have that. I mean, the approach BBC Scotland has taken in this space is that the use of Scots, in a sense, is integrated across our mainstream services. So when we created the BBC Scotland channel, for example, the expectation would be that we would reflect Scots language within that output. If you look at the slate of drama that BBC Scotland has developed over the last 5 or 6 years, in comedy too, you'll have seen through the characterisation in those programmes, whether it's Two Doors Down or Guilt or River City, you see the characterisation and the language come through those programmes. We have not taken, if you like, the Welsh and Gaelic model of creating standalone services. That's not from a point of principle or policy.
No, I don't think for a moment it is. I just don't think you probably thought about it. You're absolutely right. It's used in drama. I said that. It's used in music. We know that. And I'm putting to you, and I notice you're not saying I'm wrong, that you haven't used it in other spheres which would give it a certain status. And I'm suggesting to you and putting it to you that you should ask the people if they want that. More than 1 million people in the last census said they spoke Scots. I can't imagine any other country where you would have that number of people who are given no provision of any kind in their native language in using current affairs. It would be unthinkable. And I just think that's something you should think about.
Well, as I say, I think our linguistic policy across all the minority languages is going to evolve. And as I say, if we see clear evidence of audience demand for that space, that's something I know colleagues at BBC Scotland will look at.
Rhodri Williams, just finally before I hand back to the chair, am I right that S4C, Winfrey Evans, who challenged the government over this after a broken promise, that was a landmark, was it not, that perhaps saved the language?
Yes, I think the establishment of S4C in '92 was a historic moment for the language. There have been equally significant developments since then, particularly in relation to Welsh government support for the language, the status of the language, the development of Welsh medium. Most children who learn Welsh in schools in Wales come from families where neither parent could speak Welsh.
Just a generation.
Yes.
I used to do a youth programme where I was very struck with the fact that the Welsh-speaking kids were often so articulate and so confident, and what they told me at the time was they could talk to their grandparents in Welsh, but their parents didn't speak it. And that's a very unusual thing, isn't it, internationally? Maybe Catalonia had that a bit, but to see that skip of a generation is remarkable.
There certainly has been a lot of that, but even now you have lots of people in Welsh medium education who have no linguistic background at all, and increasingly, and hopefully we've helped, along with BBC Radio Cymru, have helped play a part in that. You can watch Welsh language television, listen to Welsh language radio, and hear a diversity of voices that you wouldn't have heard back in 1982. But I think the establishment of the service, the credibility that gave, the legitimisation of the language which in those days was even bigger in its impact than perhaps today, in that there were only 4 televisions. Status.
I'm going to hand back to the chair now. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. Can I just go back to something that you said, John? You talked about the importance of being able to segue into a kind of digital provision because of the drop off in linear TV audiences. In 2022, S4C received an extra £7.5 million, Rhodri, to support your digital development. Can you just quickly talk us through why that was important and what you used it for?
Well, developing content that is distributed on a wide variety of digital platforms is a significant step ahead from traditional linear broadcasting. I think, with the benefit of hindsight, I think S4C were probably behind the curve and didn't follow the lead that was taken by the BBC when John Burt, took the BBC into the digital world. I think the importance of that extra 7.5 million was to allow us to develop that distribution strategy in a way which didn't take away from money that was spent on content itself. My view is that we'd have had to have done it anyway, but of course, had we done it without the 7.5 million, there'd be 7.5 million pounds worth less of content to be distributed on YouTube or on Facebook. And I think that has, we're still in that, most of the listening is still to live television, but the growth in listening to our own media player, Click, but perhaps more significantly to Welsh content, to S4C content on the BBC's iPlayer, where of course the impact of the technology there is so great, in the same way as our content that's distributed on YouTube reaches audiences that our linear broadcasts wouldn't reach. So that's been a key part of the development. And when we think of the importance of attracting viewers of a younger age group, you only need to look at some of the the Ofcom statistics on this, that young people do not watch linear television at all, almost. I think there's an exception around some sort of live events, but generally speaking, people up to the age of about 24, their use of linear television has disappeared. So being able to facilitate that development into digital distribution and taking some original content but some repurposed content and distributing it on the platforms that are best suited to the target audiences was a very important step as far as we were concerned, and we were very, very grateful to the government for allowing us to be able to do that.
Thank you. John, you also mentioned that you'd like to see a commitment to Gaelic services in the media bill as it progresses. Is there anything else that you'd like to see in the media bill that it isn't already there?
Yes, can I touch on digital?
Of course you can.
Because that is critical for the future, like every other language. Gaelic, BBC Alba is losing around 15% of viewers on linear TV, the box in the corner, every year. A lot of them are moving to digital, but we are losing people. And when I said that S4C and Welsh set the gold standard, can I upgrade that to platinum standard?
Oh, okay.
Because £7.5 million, we didn't get any money.
No.
We got zero. And we looked across to Ireland. We worked with TG Care over there. They've had €20 million since 2021 for the digital transition. We have had nothing. So if we take one aspect of that, so we were able to do 3 hours of drama last year. So we did 3 hours of a new drama called An Claw Mór. And if you put that into box set consumption, that is one night's viewing for one family for one evening's viewing. The other 364 nights, they have to go elsewhere because we don't have the money to do drama. We're now doing a new drama this year, which is a co-production across other countries. So we're putting in £1 million. We're getting £3 million in, but that's still only 4 by 50 minutes. So that's probably a Friday night and a Saturday night for families across the UK, and then they go elsewhere. And we are at high risk. So this digital transition is hugely important. In the media bill, to answer your direct question, is we need two things. We need recognition and we need security, and we need... So when the last bill, the communications bill of 2003 went through, BBC Alba didn't exist. MG Alba, as it exists today, didn't exist. We need protection. And we need to say there will be a service for Gaelic speakers and for people who want to learn the language, and also the people that consume the music programmes, the drama programmes we'd love to make. So all these programmes through subtitles are accessible and increasingly watched by people across the UK. So we need that, but equally importantly, we need a funding mechanism that unravels this kind of slightly crazy situation we're in, where you legislate, Ofcom regulates, BBC partners us, Scottish Government pays for us, and we don't know who to ask when we're looking for more money and when we're looking for more programmes.
Very helpful, thank you. Do either of the Rhodris have anything that they would like also added into the media bill?
I think the provisions around prominence for all of us are incredibly important. I think in an increasingly globalised space, the ability of UK stories in whatever language to be front and centre within that media experience is incredibly important. But I think the provisions support that, and as John says, I think that recognition of the need for an ongoing, enduring Gaelic language service feels entirely appropriate.
Yeah.
I'd endorse that completely.
We like it when everybody's in agreement with each other. Very good.
Very much.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent. Let's move on to Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. How important is it to you, Rhodri Williams, and you, John Morrison, just to be really clear which Rhodri I'm talking to, that Welsh and Gaelic have particular status or indeed level of recognition by either the UK government or devolved governments? Rhodri.
I think it's essential. Without going into the background of how we got to where we were, I think getting recognition in an industry, the UK creative industries are a huge success story, and it's a challenge to anyone, I think, who's adjacent, even if you're even further away than we are, to maintain your cultural activity in the shadow of the huge success of the UK's cultural industries. But I think being able to do that, and certainly some of the successes we've had with co-productions with the BBC, if you think of something, a drama that was on BBC Network, Keeping Faith, was an original S4C drama. We've since partnered with Channel 4. We've sold drama series to Netflix. Haven't quite yet achieved the success that some of the Irish language content creators have done by winning an Oscar for a film in the Irish language recently. But the importance of that in legitimising the use of the language, in making it look and sound attractive to people, and for people to have the confidence to think, there's a future in this. Mm-hmm. Yes, there is value in sending my children to a Welsh medium school, to encouraging them to use the language at home, to use it ourselves at home, which was absent, certainly when I think back to my childhood. The only people in certain areas where I lived, I moved around quite a lot when I was young, and in some of those areas, the only people who spoke Welsh were old people, and young people didn't see the relevance of the language. And I think the role of the media, it used in 1982 it was about linear television. Now it's around digital media, in legitimising that and in in giving people the freedom to express themselves, as Rhodri mentioned earlier, and to do things and to be creative in their own language or in the language of their choice is hugely significant and plays, I would say, a core role in any attempt to, depending how you'd like to describe it, to preserve or to secure the future of a minority language.
Fingers crossed for that, Oscar. John?
Okay, fingers crossed for us as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, you need three things when you're trying to grow and revive a language. You need the visibility or normalisation. Television gives you that. You need usage, which television gives you and encourages both in the home and in the classroom and in the playground. And now, because we're doing a lot of sport on BBC Alba, it means that young people are now tuning in to see their favourite football teams, rugby teams, and we'd love to do to other sports. It's also encouraging people to learn the language. So we've got Speak Gaelic, Learn Gaelic. So Learn Gaelic is getting 500,000 unique users, which is 500,000 unique users, which is really important. And the critical thing from our point of view is that we are not looking for a handout here. And this is really important for the public purse in these times where, we know money is tight. So we did, when we got this analysis done on what the money that is spent with MG Alba means. So for every pound that we get, we create £1.34 for the economy. That means that you're not wasting your money, you're actually investing it in the UK and the Scottish economy. We're creating jobs in places like Stornoway in Uist. We're creating apprenticeships where we're working with arts organisations. So we're creating 4 apprenticeships based in the Western Isles with arts organisations who are also struggling for funding. But these 4 young people will also create digital content both for the arts organisation, but also that we hope we will be able to use on the BBC Alba channels as well. So it's an investment in young people, it's an investment in the language, it gives the taxpayer a return for its money, and also we are entertaining 300,000 people every week who tune in to BBC Alba. We would like to do more, a lot more, and if we got more cash, more support, think of the multiplier. We would give you more return for your money.
Thank you, John. Staying with you, what are the implications of a language being protected under the Council of Europe Charter for regional or minority languages? What does that mean in reality for you?
What it means is that it gives you protection and it gives you status, and it means, that governments like this government and the Scottish government will hopefully listen to that. But what we need is the practical application of that, and the practical application of that is being taught, being broadcast, telling stories. Gaelic radio is on the air from 7:30 in the morning till midnight. So Gaelic speakers all over the country can tune in. They can also learn, they can hear people. You were talking, Mr. Nicholson, about the importance of the different genre. You get all that on radio. We want to see that on television. So the sort of lofty ideals of the European Charter, that is fantastic. What it means for the ordinary Gaelic speaker is manifested only through speaking the language, teaching the language, watching it on their television. That's the practical aspect of it, which encourages people to use the language, and usage. Without usage, the language dies.
Thank you, John. Same question to you, Rhodri Williams.
I think the Charter is more useful to languages that have lesser support, if you like. Certainly, if we think of its implications for Wales, they are not particularly significant because there is such a high level of support for the language, both from the UK government through what we deliver and what the BBC delivers through the licence fee, and then through the Welsh Government's interventions across a variety of policy areas. If you draw the comparison, though, with somewhere like Brittany, where the Breton language does not enjoy anything like that level of support from the French government, indeed from certainly people I speak to in Brittany, they say that there still exists antagonism towards the Breton language in France, and there I think the significance of the European Charter is essential. But to us, in a sense, we've moved on to a higher level of support and activity.
And over to the BBC, Rhodri. So the Charter, what does that mean for the BBC and the services it provides?
I think in truth that the primary mechanism in terms of minority languages for the BBC is the Charter agreement. As it stands, the Charter makes clear commitments in Gaelic, in Welsh, in Ulster Scots and in the Irish language. Clearly the media bill is looking at expanding the PSB remit into Scots and Cornish. So that would be a conversation then between us and Ofcom at the point of the renewal of the Charter in terms. So I think that is the primary driver for our, if you like, linguistic policy development rather than the Council Charter.
Let's focus on the Cornish then for a second. Sure. Radio Cornwall used to provide a weekly news bulletin in Cornish, which I've heard a couple of times. I can't pretend I understood a word of it, but it was nice to hear it. Are you committed to that sort of programming in the future, and does it still actually exist?
Yeah, it still exists. I think it's one original broadcast a week. I believe it's repeated. I think it's a Friday and Sunday, but I may be corrected on that. Yes, we are committed to that. I think we've also made some steps in terms of Cornish short films on iPlayer, which I welcome. But clearly, it goes back to Mr. Nicholson's question earlier. I think the evolution of the policy discussion around Cornish is at an earlier stage. I guess the question I would have if we were to look at any expansion in that space is, do you focus on building a presence on Radio Cornwall, or do you focus in terms of the digital opportunity online?
What would be your preference at this stage?
The honest answer to that is that it would depend on and forgive my ignorance, it would depend on the linguistic composition of that audience. So you need to look at whether, to go back to the conversation we were having earlier on Gaelic, you would need to look at whether growth or the large part of the Cornish speakers are being driven through education and younger or older. So you need to look at the demographic profile of the language, and you need to, in a sense, adapt your media response to that profile. And I'm not sure I would have a sufficient grasp of the composition of the sort of the Cornish cohort at the moment to take
Obviously,
a view on that.
There's no devolved government in Cornwall. There is a devolution deal. But if we then move to the Channel Islands, just for a second, the states of Jersey and the states of Guernsey obviously have done work to protect their individual languages, so that's Gérié and Guernesiais. What do you think could be done in the Channel Islands to protect those languages, which obviously were hugely reduced due to the evacuation back in the Second World War?
Yeah, I think probably the right response would be through the two local radio stations. There is clearly an online news presence there as well. But I guess the key question is, how can both those stations reflect the linguistic diversity of those islands? But again, I'd need to look at the detail of that to work out what the best response would be.
Because at one point, when I worked at BBC Radio Jersey, to be clear, they had a weekly news bulletin in Gérié, and I did try and learn Gérié live on air, which was, I'm glad no clips exist of that. But it is really important.
They might.
It would be great if they could continue to be lost. But it is really important to protect those languages too, because we see the surnames in the UK, the families that were evacuated, and keeping those flames alive is really, really important. Even if the number of people who actually speak, in particularly Guernesiais, I believe, is very, very low.
And I think one of the challenges, it goes back to Cornish as well, is having a really clear sense of the scale of the community and what demographic changes are happening within that linguistic community. And I think our understanding perhaps of Gaelic and Welsh, and for different reasons Ulster Scots and the Irish language, are probably ahead of what our detailed understanding of both Scots and Cornish.
You know, if there's regular discussion between the states of Jersey and the states of Guernsey and the BBC about language provision in the Channel Islands?
I wouldn't say regular conversation. I mean, clearly the editors and our head of Southwest, Steph Marshall, engages with those authorities. I couldn't tell you on the frequency of that.
Thank you.
I've never had you down as a GREO speaker.
Trust me, I wasn't.
Sure. Thank you very much. Clive, please.
I feel challenged by that, Simon. Waiting
Yeah.
for weather in Cockney rhyming slang. Could I just... this question had been partly answered earlier on, but if I come to you, Rhodri Williams, in terms of broadcasting is a reserved power for the UK government, but the responsibility for promoting minority languages is devolved. What challenges does that create for you?
There can be, and I think if you listen to views expressed in the Senedd in Cardiff, you can see that there is a desire from some corners to have greater influence in broadcasting policy. It's currently discussed in the context of appointing my successor, because you have 3 different models with 3 different organisations. My successor will be appointed by a panel which has a Welsh Government representative on it. The member of the BBC board is appointed again by DCMS, but this time the Welsh Government actually have to agree with DCMS as to who that person is. And if you go to Ofcom, the Welsh member, and there's recently been a new appointment of Sir Clive Jones as the Welsh member of the Ofcom board, he is appointed, or she, if it was female, would be appointed by the Welsh Government. So I think there are tensions there, but I think what I'd like to stress is that I think that, and I should declare an interest in that, I worked for Ofcom for almost 15 years, that I think there is an interest in having media policy at some level in one place. We, as a very small part of the ecology of UK broadcasting, are governed by the same rules and regulations that apply to the BBC, to ITV, to Sky. And there is an expertise within the Department of Culture, Media and Sport that is shared across their various organisations for whom they have responsibility. And I think there is value in that. There is also great value, and this is something that came into existence following an independent review of S4C undertaken in 2018, of having, as we do now have, a memorandum of understanding with the Welsh Government to secure cooperation on educational resources, on supporting Welsh learners, on work on intergenerational transmission of the language. And I think that is the best of both worlds. I find it very difficult to imagine a situation where you could take one piece of broadcasting and sort of take it out of the rest of the family of UK public service broadcasting, and also the importance of the current situation whereby we work closely with and are beneficiaries of having such an agreement as we have with the BBC. I can't stress too much how important it is that S4C's content is distributed on the iPlayer. More people are accessing it on the iPlayer as time goes on, and that is of huge significance to that. Whether you could have that if we were sort of cut loose and completely independent of that family of UK public service broadcasters, I'm not sure.
So would you, on balance then, would you just say that the balance is right, and that always there more that you would see devolved to?
I think at the moment it is right. I think there are benefits from what comes of being a part of the UK regulation of broadcasting, and there are benefits clearly of working closely with the Welsh Government to secure that we're working in cohesion with each other. And it's not only the Welsh Government, it's with organisations such as the National Centre for Learning Welsh, so that what we are doing ties in with what's being done in schools and in other institutions in Wales, so that there's a coordinated policy there, that we are just not going off and doing our own thing, that what we are doing is tying in with what's being done by other organisations. So I'm certainly pretty satisfied with the status quo.
So, John, what do you think to add to that? Are you doing your own thing?
I think we are very happy with the relationship with the BBC, because the iPlayer is really important for Gaelic programming going forward. But in terms of between the two governments, this Parliament has been very good to Gaelic. It created Gaelic broadcasting, gave it a cohesion. We have a channel now, but as I've said earlier, we need protection. We probably need public service broadcasting status for MG Alba, but we also need somewhere between all these stools that govern Gaelic. So we've got this Parliament legislating for it, we've got Scottish Government paying for it through Ofcom regulating us, and then the partnership with the BBC. We don't know where to turn, so it's really complex. What we would like is a simple where somebody says this is what a Gaelic service should look like, and this is how much it should cost and how much the governments pay for it.
So I mean, someone, but who would you say should say that?
Well, I don't think the current structure is working for us, because there doesn't seem to be anybody that you can name.
Is that more devolution to
well, in terms of the politics, it could be the Secretary of State, or it could be with the Minister who pays for it. But if you have the Minister that pays for it deciding the sufficiency, there's a bit of a conflict in there. If you're paying for something and you're deciding how much there should be, I can foresee a bit of an issue there. But what we want is clarity, sufficient that there is a proper service.
I mean, it is, because I'm not fully following what the problem is. Is the problem that actually there's no individual that you go to or individual point that you go to say we need more money, or is it that there are too many points of?
It's a bit of both, actually.
Right.
So, and if under this bill it doesn't give any clarification either. So under this bill, Ofcom decides what is sufficient. And that's the phrase that's used. But if they decided that there wasn't, what is being offered isn't sufficient, who do they ask for more money from? Is it from the BBC, or is it from the Scottish Government? And can they make the BBC pay more money? I think the answer is probably no, because we sit outside the Charter. Can they go to the Scottish Government? Ofcom, I don't think, has any authority over the Scottish minister, what Scottish ministers do and pay. So we're caught in the middle of this, and we do right now. We have nobody, and I suspect the way the devolution settlement sits at the moment, that it should probably sit with the Secretary of State. But I don't want to go into where devolution goes in the future or whatever. But what we would want is a mechanism whereby your funding is assured and that we know who to go to.
But are there any areas where the devolved government could assist? I mean, for instance, is there anything preventing them putting more money in, albeit through Ofcom?
You need to ask them that. We would love if they put more money. We have asked them, but they say that they are under funding pressure across every aspect of government.
They've got the same problem as the BBC.
So yeah, they do. But it's a huge issue for us. It's an existentialist threat to us, actually, because the trajectory is downwards. And if we go beyond 2026, we'll have less than 50% of the budget we have. We can't. We are running out of road at BBC Alba.
You've sat in the middle of both Welsh and Scottish language TV. Have you got anything to add, Rhodri?
I think that if you look at just through a BBC lens, what you'll find is clearly DCMS, UK government, broadcasting powers reserved to UK government, but we have very active relationships with each of the devolved governments. So if you look at the partnerships, for example, that BBC Scotland has with Creative Scotland, or Wales with Creative Wales, with BBC Northern Ireland with NI Screen, there are active, we look both ways. We clearly overall broadcast policy set here in London. And I think there are good reasons why that model works. If you think about the level of international and global competition now in the media space, you think about the debate that we've had over the last 2 or 3 years around the importance of prominence. The ability to take a UK-wide view on those matters probably makes more sense in terms of the scale of the challenge that we're facing in a regulatory setting. But I think sometimes we forget how much things have moved. I mean, Rhodri's just described to you the appointment process for the BBC board members for the devolved nations. That effectively Welsh Government have to approve. We lay our accounts and our annual report in front of the Welsh Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, and we regularly do hearing sessions and see ourselves as accountable to those parliaments too. So I think things have moved enormously. The reality is a broadcaster like the BBC is always looking in both directions.
Thank you, Clive. And finally, Jane.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for some really interesting thoughts this morning. I was going to ask about digital sort of content and updating, which we've touched on throughout the responses today. Rhodri, Talfan, Davies, you mentioned the demographic profile of a language currently as dictating output and content at the moment, or certainly influences that. I'm just... How much of your thinking is in the responsibility to grow and nurture new audiences and new languages? How far ahead are you thinking in terms of how your content can affect the growth of language in the future, combined with that digital challenge? Shall I start with Rhodri Williams?
I think that's our fundamental purpose. I think that's why S4C was created, and I think that's why it exists. We did some work with staff about 4 or 5 years ago and undertook an exercise to sort of ask people, well, why do they think we existed? And it came out very clearly that they identified with being a part of that process of trying to take the language, not just obviously you provide a service to people who speak the language every day, but that sort of sense of taking it beyond that, new audiences, primarily younger ones from diverse ethnic backgrounds, ones from diverse social backgrounds, diverse geographic backgrounds, and of course to take it to younger audiences is fundamental to what we do. Now, you quite often get some discussion in the Welsh media as to whether the emphasis is too much on the traditional, on those who are committed. We hear stories about people who listen to S4, turn S4C on in the evening and keep it there, and that's all they listen to for a while. But we know that younger people don't consume media in that way, and I think getting that balance right, providing a service that answers the legitimate needs of Welsh speakers is one half of the equation, but expanding the audience, attracting new viewers, making the language relevant to younger speakers or potential speakers is absolutely fundamental. If there is one thing that S4C has to do, that's it.
And I presume digitalising content and leaving it online, so availability for school resources and things, that will change. That's made it easier to kind of fulfil the learning part of this.
Yes, because that gives greater value, if you like. So if you have a drama series or a film that is based on Welsh literature where the book is a part of the national curriculum, having that accessible to schools free of charge through the Welsh Government's hub network is a key development. Likewise, people who are learning the language, and there are more and more of those, they can make use of our programs. There is a variety of sort of linguistic register that's used in our program. Some that perhaps you'd need quite a high level of fluency in Welsh to understand completely, but others that people learning the language would understand, and being able to cover that range and provide something that can be used. And as you say, once it's online, you don't have, it's not a case of, oh, well, I missed that, it was on last night. You can go back to it over a long period of time, and you can go back to it through a variety of platforms, not only YouTube, Facebook, and the like, but through Click, our own media player, and as I referred to earlier, through the BBC's iPlayer. So that is one of the huge benefits, I think, of digitalisation, where this is not a cheap business to run. Creating compelling content is not cheap, but you get greater value from it if it can be made available on a variety of platforms and for a long period of time.
Can I can sing you a very bad Welsh national anthem, but I don't speak any Welsh apart from that. But do you subtitle your Welsh language in English so that people who are living sort of non-Welsh speakers, can they sing English?
Yes, I think
so that already
I can't remember the exact percentage of our programs, but it's probably close to 90% of our programs are subtitled in English, and a growing proportion of our that's again another benefit of digital technology. You can actually provide subtitles in Welsh as well as in English, so that people who maybe are fairly long way down the process of learning the language, they might want to see the Welsh subtitles. But whereas other people, obviously, if they're listening to commentary on a sporting event or a cultural event, will appreciate the opportunity to, maybe they'll pick up, hopefully they will pick up some Welsh as they listen to it, but they can also read subtitles in English as well.
Thank you. And John, this probably sounds like the land of milk and honey. Is that what you would hope to do?
As a board, we have a policy of digital first, and we're moving towards that, despite the fact that unlike the Welsh and the Irish, we've been given no money to do this, but we know that is where the future lies. So we have to follow where the audience already is. The young audience is already moving there. Linear television is dropping, according to Ofcom. I think it was last year, it was 13 or 15%. So it's falling away. They still remain important for us, but digital is where it's at. And I know the BBC has a role in trying to develop new audiences. We can help do that if we had, through the content we have. We've had to have a policy of what we call tent poles. So every month we will do something that we think will have more impact and will draw in new audiences. So it could be music, it could be sport, it could be an education program, so that we push that really hard. But we would love more money to be doing it. I sound terrible, don't I, asking for money for everything? But we need digital, and we need to be there. We need to be on all these platforms for the young audience. Otherwise, this language is dying.
And someone mentioned YouTube, putting content on YouTube. I think it was you, Rhodri Williams. Do you use YouTube already?
We do, and we will look at a variety of platforms. And what we're finding actually is that for the young audience, short form content is what they're really interested in. So we're very keen to produce more short form content as well, because it's critical. You bring the young people in, and then when you think about the iPlayer, when you think about the huge challenges a major broadcaster like the BBC has with Netflix, Amazon Prime, all these global, then think about if you are trying to encourage people to watch Gaelic programmes. They need to find us. We need to be discoverable. We need discoverability on the iPlayer, and thankfully with the partnership with the BBC, I think that's something that we're working very hard on. But we need to be there, but we also need to be on other platforms for the young audience.
And Clive, my colleague, touched on it a little bit. Do you think that engagement between schools and educators and government and content production, is that good enough, or could there be more done for a sort of grand scheme master plan in terms of what content?
From our point of view, I think we can do. We do a lot of Gaelic language learning. It started off on radio. It's now on television. It's incredibly popular, and if we're going to grow Gaelic as a language, the Gaelic language learning. Duolingo actually started doing a Gaelic class, and they have 1.8 million people subscribed to Gaelic. There's 70,000 people who use Gaelic every day. So that shows not just the appeal within the UK, but the global appeal. So we can answer that, we can help that by doing Gaelic programmes, which are then available digitally. We can support it. We already work very closely with the schools, so all the programmes are available for schools. And if schools are doing similarly to what they're doing in Wales, if we do a historical programme, that is available through the education process.
And you mentioned just finally Nova Scotia. Do people in Nova Scotia access your content as
do
far
they?
As
They
can
probably
now?
do when we put it on digitally. I don't think they'll be able to watch BBC Alba legally in Nova Scotia. But very interestingly, we started a thing about just about when the channel started called Film G, which was encouraging people in schools to make programmes and make short films. And it started off with, I think, 16 entries. This year we had 170 short films created by kids in their own time. So this has all been woven into the education curriculum. So it's teaching them writing skills, it's teaching them presentation skills. The confidence Mr. Nicholson spoke about is there. You can see it on the screen. So that is available, and Film G has been a huge success. I've met actually educators from one local authority who said that's the most excited their kids get is when they are given their mobile phones, and we send producers into the schools to work with them to show them, although quite often they're actually very adept at doing films on their own phones. So it's all working. Can we do more? Of course we can.
Lovely thought to finish on. Thanks,
Lovely,
Chair.
Jane. Thank you very much. And gentlemen, thank you all very much for your time today. If you've got any other thoughts after the end of this session, then do please feel free to email the committee. We'd be very happy to hear them as we gather our evidence for our report. So thank you all very much today. Can I invite our next panel to come forward now, please?
Thank you all very much.
Panel focuses on individuals in broadcasting who are serving minority language communities. We are joined by Billy Kay, a Scots language writer and broadcaster. We're joined by Caoimhe ní Chathail, an Irish language producer and presenter for BBC Gaelic. Helen Mark, presenter for BBC Northern Ireland in Ulster, Scots, and Laura Giles from Screen Cornwall. Thank you very much for joining us today. You're all very welcome. I'm going to start with John for question number 1, please.
Thank you, and lovely to see you all, and what an amazing diversity of languages before us. It's an important inquiry. You've been listening to the previous evidence, I think, which was interesting. Could I start off with you, Mr. Kay? As I put it to Mr. Morrison, the decline of Gaelic was not an accidental thing, but it was a deliberate matter of policy. And I on one side, have a Gaelic-speaking grandmother, and the other side, I have a Scots language-speaking grandmother. Gaelic-speaking grandmother was belted for speaking Gaelic. Scots grandmother was just corrected all the time, with the implication that she was speaking substandard English. I had the same experience at school myself. I remember an essay where I talked about my wee brother. The teacher put a red line through wee and asked if that meant small or stunted or younger. We all know what your wee brother is. It was a ridiculous thing to say. What do you think, what effect have the attacks on Scots for 200 years since the Union, what effect have they had on the language?
First of all, they've given people doubts about their identity. Scottish anti-citizenship, the pulling of the character in different directions. The heart versus head appeal to both sides. George Gordon, Lord Byron, said, "For I'm half a Scot by birth and bred a whole one, and my heart flies to my head." Hugh MacDiarmid called Earth in the universe the bonny brookit bairn, the beautiful neglected child. And in a way, Scots is the beautiful neglected child of minority languages in the United Kingdom. We are among the strongest with speakers. We have 1.5 million speakers, greater than Welsh or Gaelic or probably all the other minority languages put together, but we have less recognition than any of them. And that produces a dichotomy in the Scottish psyche. It's completely relevant that the greatest works on the divided self by R.D. Laing and by writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were written by Scots. It produces a dichotomy, a pulling of different directions. And that has an effect on people's confidence growing up. If your major institutions do not recognise the way you speak, if your literature is not taught in school, apart from on Burns's day, that was an irony that I had as a child growing up in Ayrshire in the 1950s, where you literally got a prize one day a week for speaking Robert Burns's poetry, and you could get the belt, the toss, corporal punishment, the other 364 days for speaking his language. So these are the ironies of that situation. Things are better today. Attitudes are better. Schools are more positive. But the gaping hole that we're here to discuss today is the fact that people are sympathetic towards Scots in broadcasting, but they usually do nothing about projecting that sympathy onto active encouragement of programming in Scots.
That's interesting. I mean, I know a Scots language broadcaster who was specifically told by the BBC producers not to use Scots. It's his native language, just as it's your native language. You're not speaking your native language, you're speaking English, which I know is not your native language. I myself understand Scots. You could speak to me in Scots, I think I'd get all of it, but I would struggle to construct sentences in Scots. I'd have to think about it quite carefully. You'll have heard the evidence from the previous panel. Rhodri from the BBC, when I asked him why there was no provision of news and current affairs in Scots, I could tell from his expression he'd never even thought about that. He gave quite a corporate answer, but he hadn't really thought about that. And he told me, of course, there's Scots provision in drama and music. Well, we know that. But am I right that one of the things that happened after the Act of Union was that all the leaders of the country, whether it was the lawyers or the aristocrats or the monarch himself a century before, who'd been Scots language speakers, went south and they all started speaking English. And that meant that society's leaders no longer spoke Scots but spoke English. What effect did that have, and what's the ongoing effect? And while you're at it, tell me what the BBC should be doing.
Well, it had the effect of a slow percolation down through the society of thinking that English was the language of prestige and power, that London was where the action was, and if you wanted to get ahead and make money, then London was the place to be. And to get by in London, you should adapt your Scots and speak standard English. On a positive side, that led to bilingualism, and bilingualism is a wonderful thing. The fact that I was brought up bilingual in Scots and English meant that I found it easy to learn French, German, Portuguese and Russian later on in life. So we're all supporting bilingualism. But the downside of it is when your language is curtailed is the negative aspect of that needs to be balanced positively by positive discrimination in favour of it today. The history of Scots in the BBC, for example, is that I made a series in the 1980s called The Mother Tongue. The BBC couldn't quite bring itself to call it The Mither Tongue, which was based on the book that I wrote. And later on, about 10 years later, there was another series on the history of the language by Carol McDougall, and then another gap of about 15 years to a programme called Rebel Tongue, which was broadcast about 4 years ago, presented by Alistair Heather. And every time the BBC does a major programme or series in Scots, they think, that's it, I've done it. I can ignore it now for another decade. So roughly every decade there's been a programme in Scots. That's why when we hear about the provision for Gaelic and for Welsh, and literally where you're talking about millions of pounds being poured into the languages, good on them and well done for the professional body that's got that support. We think of the Bonnie Brook at Bairn, the beautiful neglected child, and literally a couple of 100,000 supporting all of the people who work in Scots, half a day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. And yet, this glorious language with a literary tradition that produced the greatest poetry in Europe between 1450 and 1550, that continued in the 18th and 19th century to produce world figures like Robert Ferguson and Robert Burns, and in the 19th century produced great figures like Robert Louis Stevenson and Sir Walter Scott, whose best work, again, was in Scots, through to the present day with MacDiarmid and the great writers working in Scots today. The fact that that language does not have the support of major broadcasters and only appears sporadically, usually around Burns's day, is a tragedy. One of the great Scottish historians of the 20th century, Professor Barrow, Geoffrey Barrow, in his inaugural lecture at Edinburgh University, said that one of the greatest tragedies of Scottish life of the 20th century was that broadcasting was not devolved. In other words, it's up to London and Westminster to support these native languages. And if there is such a thing as Britishness, then all of the parts of Britishness should be supported and should be funded equally. And that is why it's important that groups like this are here today to hear, on a very rare occasion, about the existence of these different traditions within the islands.
Excellent and well said, and I couldn't agree more. Turning to Irish, of course, one of the interesting things about Ireland is how much support Irish was given from the foundation of the Irish state and independence for Ireland. But in Northern Ireland, of course, that status has been contested, hasn't it? We've seen a huge stooshy over the respect that Irish should be given, with one particular community objecting to it. We don't have those issues in Scotland over language. What particular problems do they present for you, where half of Northern Ireland is encouraged to think of Irish as something other?
Well, I think to start off with the similarities that Billy mentioned there, when we look at languages and minority languages within these islands, they're often looked as hobby languages. They're looked at things that people do for enjoyment, or they do it because they love music or history or whatever. But for many people within these islands, it's their everyday life. And when I think of my own life, I get up in the morning, I speak to my daughter in Gaelic, I get her ready, brushing her teeth, all of that's done through Gaelic. I bring her to an Irish medium school. Again, I'm speaking with her classroom assistant, her teacher. All of those interactions are done within the Irish language. So for me, it's very much my reality and it's my everyday reality, and I'm sure it's the same for many of my colleagues here. But in terms of looking at, you're saying half the community think it's other, I would argue with that. I would say that in many times the audiences and the community are light years ahead of politicians and are light years ahead of legislation as well. And I think that there are many people doing fantastic work within Northern Ireland and in other places to dispel those myths around the Irish language belong to one community. If we look at the Presbyterians and the role that they had in reviving the Irish language, that's something to be celebrated. And for me, that's a really important part of my life. I'm in a mixed marriage, as they call it, in terms of...
Oh, I know that expression. And Carson himself, am I right, was a Gaelic speaker.
Was indeed, born in Dublin. So there are many myths surrounding the Irish language, but if I kind of look at, why do we do it and why is it important for us to have Irish language broadcasting? For us, and I'm sure it's the same for yourselves, our audiences are at the heart of everything that we do, and it's about representation. It's about them turning on the TV and seeing themselves or people similar to themselves, hearing their own stories. And for me, growing up in West Belfast, I have to say that the BBC wasn't a place where I felt like I could see myself. And that has changed over the years. 1981 was the first radio programme in the Irish language, and then in 1991 the first TV programme. So now we have the Irish language heard almost every day on Radio Ulster, and then we have at least weekly or bi-weekly we have a programme on BBC Two Northern Ireland as well. So that visibility is hugely important for those. There are almost 8,000 children attending Irish medium education in Northern Ireland alone, and I think for those children to grow up and to see their language, to hear their language, it's so vitally important, because let's not forget, they also have English. They have that added value of having all the skills in both languages. And
we know that more children speak different languages, the more languages that they learn. Helen, what are the similarities and the differences with Scots language in terms of community support for it in Northern Ireland? I mean, do you make common cause with the Scots language challenges or with the Irish language challenges, or neither?
Well, I think they feel a bit of both, but let's say particularly with the Scots, there's a lot of what you were saying, Billy, chimes with us. And the Ulster Scots language, as with Irish, became politicised. Do you know, it was the common parlance for tens of thousands of people for many centuries. And the point came when it was, like in Scots, it was banished from schools. You were not speaking proper English. All those sorts of things were happening. People were told, you're never going to get yourself a good job if you speak like that. So, it was denigrated, it was devalued. All those sorts of things were happening with Ulster Scots. Now, I think I'm like a modern day Ulster Scots, because I'm Scots. But I have been in Ulster for over 40 years, so I feel like I'm a modern-day Ulster Scots. And it's been a real... Actually, at first I was quite ashamed that I came to Ulster and I had no idea what Ulster Scots was. I had no idea of this common history between our two countries, which was terrible. It just was never talked about. And since, although I do lots of other broadcasting work, coming into Ulster Scots Broadcasting, I feel really proud to be able to find people who are willing to share their story, share their language on air on the BBC. And we would love that there was more of it, and it has definitely developed over the 2 decades or so that I've been working, and it is so much better now, which we'll maybe come back to. But because it was politicised, because Ulster Scots became actually ridiculed in the press, in the media. At one point it was said in the press, sure, they're just making it up for the Good Friday Agreement, so they'll have a football to kick back at the Irish language, which was just just,
Sad.
I mean, it's so aggravating and just disrespectful of the whole culture that is the Ulster Scots. And people were, when in the early days, I'd be out in the streets, say, doing a recording for an Ulster Scots programme. In that day, it was for Kist o' Words. Kist is like a chest, words, obviously. Now it's for Kintra, which means your homeland, your country. But I remember the verbal abuse on the street when we were making Ulster Scots programmes. Oh, what are you doing that for? A waste of time. Hi, it's just a Ballymoney accent. It was so derogatory. Thankfully, I don't get that abuse anymore. It's become much better recognised because of all the work that's being done. Do you know Seamus Heaney, Balachi's most famous son? And you'll all know him for lots of other reasons.
I tutored at university.
Did you? Oh, that's wonderful. Well, when he wrote A Burrell for Burns, because it said that in every Ulster household there was a Bible and a copy of Burns' poetry, Seamus Heaney has this verse, and he says, "From the start, Burns' burrel and rhythm, the tongue the Ulster Scots brought with them, and stick to still in County Antrim, was in my ear. It westered in from east of the Bann on the Derry air." Now, if a man of that magnitude can recognise the Ulster Scots language, well, to hell with the rest of the people that they can't accept it, because it is a truly important part of the story of Ulster as we live in now.
Thank you. Laura, Cornish, fascinating language related, as we know, to Welsh and to Breton. But am I right in saying there are challenges with Cornish that don't exist with these other languages? Because Cornish died, didn't it? In the 1860s, the bridge went across, and that was the end of Cornish. So we don't actually know how Cornish sounded. We can imagine because of the relationships with other languages. But you're trying to do something very different from all the other witnesses today, which is you're trying to bring a language back from extinction. And I don't think there's many examples around the world where that has been successful. Hebrew's obviously one, but with Hebrew, I think the rhythms continued to be repeated in Manx. It died the death, didn't it? But it was still repeated in the Manx Parliament. You don't know how Cornish sounded, I think I'm right in saying. So the challenge that you've got, if these guys' challenges are great, yours is mountainous.
So Gul Peran Lowen, happy St Piran's Day, thanks for inviting me. So yes, it's true that Cornish was seen as extinct. I think there are many kind of cultural references, like the Ordinalia plays, that are very much preserved. And what's amazing about Cornish is there's a very dedicated, voluntary community that continues to maintain and preserve and support the language. So the memory of the last speaker is very much in the past, but actually the commitment to making Cornish a contemporary language, making it relevant to the communities, their issues, their portrayal authentically on screen is absolutely the heart of what Screen Cornwall's trying to do at the moment. We have a challenge in that we have fewer people declaring themselves as primary Cornish speakers on the census. So when the director of the BBC Nations was earlier saying it's about what's sufficient to meet the need and the demand from the audience, it's true that we're at a disadvantage in that space. There are lots of people who have picked up Cornish, who are learning it, who it has come through family generations, and there's a lot of exploration of Cornish within music. Gweno, who's a Welsh Cornish musician, made an album recently that was nominated for the Mercury Prize. And culturally, the language connects with the heritage and with the present to reflect a reality of Cornwall that isn't seen from other media. So we do get a lot of people coming to Cornwall and presenting the tourist external vision of Cornwall. And we saw it particularly, around the G7 coming to Cornwall. The creative community there came together and made a film called Behind the Postcard, which was very much about what Cornwall feels should be portrayed on screen versus what the outside world portray on it. So we are at a disadvantage, but I think we're very determined to make sure that contemporary Cornwall is portrayed authentically.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, John. I'm interested to know what more the UK government or the devolved governments could do to celebrate diversity of languages across the UK and indeed to help promote them. Caoimhe, can I start with you on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think John has touched very strongly on the colonial past here and why we are in the situation that we are. And I think it is a challenging environment within the UK for minority languages due to the fact that English is the prevalent language and the language that people expect to use. I think it varies according to the legislation in the various areas, and we're in a kind of a no man's land at the minute in the north because we're awaiting our implementation of the Identity and Language Act, which will be interesting because there will be two commissioners appointed, one for Irish language and then another one for Ulster Scots and other Ulster British identity, and an Office of Identity and Cultural Expression. So although broadcasting isn't devolved, I was very interested in the conversation you had earlier about the potential for having rules within devolved as well. So that could be something that could be looked at. But also in terms of modern language learning, not just minority language, and Irish is seen as both. Language is no longer being compulsory at GCSE, has seen trends moving that teenagers choose not to study a language at school anymore because they feel that it can be more difficult to achieve the grade that they want. And so I think there has been a rapid decline in quite a lot of the languages. And if you look at German, for example, it's very, very infrequent now that people would do GCSE German. Interestingly, the Irish language has, because of Irish medium education, has kind of held its own in that regard, and GCSE Irish is something that is, the levels remain in around the same. So I think legislation's key. I think investment in broadcasting, and broadcasting is such an important element of language planning. If you're raising your family through Irish, you want to have content that your child can watch, whether it's cartoons or whatever it is. You want to see yourself reflected in the media, and so I think in terms of an increased investment, I don't think any of us would say that we have sufficient investment at the current levels that we have. So I think looking at legislation and looking at investment are key.
Thank you. Helen, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think within the Ulster Scots community, because of their experience of them being, ridiculed and so forth, they tended, and probably they're slightly more reserved as a community, that whole Presbyterianism thing. So they were not great about coming forward, raising their head above the parapet to shout out loud about their Ulster Scotsness, about their language, about their culture and heritage. Although, having said that, look at our pipe bands, we have some of the best in the world. But they would stay behind the door a wee bit and not come forward. And over the years, we have worked, anybody who's been making programming has had to encourage people to come forward to be part of Ulster Scots programming, because there was a reticence. And also when we started the Ulster Scots programming, there was a very strong emphasis on looking back to former communities, almost in a way like to justify our existence, which I suppose had to be done. There was a lot of work in trying to get people back to using the language. We sit like Scots on the English language, it's a sister language. Getting to them to use those words. They wouldn't very often do them out loud because they thought they'd be ridiculed for them. Although, ironically, I would say a huge amount of the population use Ulster Scots words, but they don't actually identify themselves as Ulster Scots. So they would hoke something out of the cupboard, read it out. They would, oh, he's a wild slabber. We all use...
Under your Oxters.
Yeah, under your Oxters. I used that on Radio 4 once, and there was, oh, why? Can't people speak English on Radio 4? So we work really hard at getting people to contribute through magazine programmes, through programming which shines a light on Ulster Scots culture and community, going behind the scenes of a pipe band, what it takes in terms of them. There's a real sense of family about being part of it, the commitment, the skills, shining a light on people who maybe didn't know they were Ulster Scots but have incredible Ulster Scots heritage. You know, there's a bit of a revival, a reawakening, I think, of Ulster Scots, and broadcasting has been at the heart of that. And if we're going to develop more of that and get more of the language just out there and enjoyed and spoken, a lot of that has to come through broadcasting, and of course supported by really good Ulster Scots education in school. Not like Irish where you can teach, you know, the whole medium of education, but really good Ulster Scots education projects in schools. There are many, like from the Ulster Scots Community Network and so forth. They're a brilliant grassroots organisation, but there needs to be so much more. Or I think we'll always be able to celebrate our heritage and culture, but what's going to be lost most of all is the language. That's what's that's the greatest threat for us. Yeah.
And Laura, down in Cornwall, is there anything more that the government could be doing to help you celebrate the diversity of the Cornish language?
Well, I think we're a bit of an outlier in the sense that we're seen as a part of England, so there isn't a devolved recognition, although we are obviously a minority nation and have recently had a monitoring visit from the Council of Europe. So I think it's great to see Cornish in the media bill. We hope that will go through, and it will open up those conversations with the BBC and other public service broadcasters around future funding, talent and skills development. The Cornish Language Office at Cornwall Council has been a mighty and kind of consistent force in trying to preserve Cornish and grow it, and Cornwall Council have adopted a lot of Cornish within their structures and their systems. I think to be transformational, a kind of an increasing scale of funding and support for Cornish content made by Cornish companies reflecting the language, culture and heritage would be what's needed to give us an equal footing with other minority languages.
Okay. Billy, of course broadcasting is a reserved matter, but how might the Scottish Language Bill that's currently in the Scottish Parliament affect the use of Scots broadcasting in Scotland?
Well, unless it's backed up with finance, possibly very little. As I say, it comes down to no new money's coming into Scottish broadcasting unless it comes from Westminster, because it's not a devolved matter. So the Scottish Government can do so much and is doing a good job in promoting, for example, it produces a budget for books being published in Scots. It's putting money into Scots education. But broadcasting is a very peculiar thing. And I think historically, Britain, because of the accident of English being the world power language through the British Empire in the 19th century and then the American Empire in the 20th century, it's as if we've lost the ability to be aware of other languages in Britain. And I think that's got worse even in the last 40 years. I had a series on working class history called Odyssey, which used Scots, broadcast on Radio 4 in the early 1980s. You don't hear any voices like that nowadays on Radio 4. It's very Anglo-centric and very Holmes Counties oriented. It's as if we've lost the ability to recognise linguistic diversity. And I think that Britain has suffered because of that too. I mean, Scots reach such a low ebb in status, and this is what we could do by giving more programmes in Scots, is raise awareness and raise status of a language, because the dialects are there, they're still spoken. What has been eroded is individual words, but the structure of the dialects is there, and the ability to revive the language is there. But an example of how low the status went, back in the 1980s, when the Scottish Government didn't even have the confidence to call itself the Scottish Government, they called themselves the Scottish Executive. I asked the Minister of Culture in the then Labour government if he had received a letter, bilingual letter in Scots and English, inviting him to the cross-party group on Scots in the Scottish Parliament. And his answer was, "Oh, that thing, written in the funny writing, I threw it in the bin." That's the level, until 30 years ago, of the attitude towards Scots in certain sections of the devolved parliament in Scotland. So this is what we've been working against. And it's, people talk about, isn't it tragic that minority languages are being eroded all the time? What's amazing is that they've survived against that kind of hostile attitude.
That's right. Thank you, Billy. Reba?
Thanks. Yeah, just wanted to ask some questions to all of you about audiences, and kind of following on from John Nicholson's point about news not normally being in these Indigenous languages. I just wondered what genre, what type of programmes is it that these audiences are after? We've heard about kids' programmes even, and the fact it seems to be a lot of cultural events. Yeah. Could start at this end and go, all the four of you. Yeah.
I'll start. Okay, so currently BBC Gaeilge are almost like a microcosm of the larger BBC NI content. So we have programmes around sport. We do have a current affairs radio programme. It's not delivering the news, it's not headlines, but it's, discussing the news and what's making the news. We have programmes around the arts, drama, educational, youth, music and documentaries and docudramas, and that's whether it's on TV platforms or on radio. So actually we are producing quite a huge variety of programmes at the minute with a small team, but our audiences expect that. They expect high quality broadcasts in their own language, and they are licence fee payers as much as anyone else, so they want that. They want to have a variety. They're hungry for new things. Now, if we were to be able to grow that, reporting government business and having a news service would be amazing. We don't currently have the capacity to do that, but it would be something that absolutely would be wanted. More documentaries, high quality drama, things like that people would really love to see. And I was really keen to hear about the Celtic Connections and the music programmes that have come out of that in Scotland, because I think there is a massive capacity to do that within Ulster Scots and Irish as well, in Northern Ireland, because we have that really strong music tradition as well. But trying to aim at younger audiences, that's key. Trying to look at the digital strategy and look at how we can entice new audiences in.
Do you know if you are reaching those younger audiences?
Well, we have a radio programme once a week that is aimed at 18 to 35. Unfortunately, I'm not in that bracket anymore, but that's just, I know. But
young, that's fine.
You're so kind. But it has had a really good response, and there's been a lot of social media interaction with it. I think social media is key, and having the capacity, which at the minute is challenging. We do have a digital producer who is trying to deal with a lot of different things, digital series focusing on, for example, sexual health and education for teenagers. So it is something that we're trying to develop, but you always will have competing interests, and with a limited budget and limited resources, you're always trying to try and manage that out.
The same for you? Or? Yeah.
Well, there is no regular programming in... Sorry.
No, Billy, I'll
briefly...
So
sorry.
You might as well finish.
There's no regular programme in Scots on the Scottish media. There's online, there's a very good service called Scots Radio, done by Frida Morrison, which you can tune into online, but the BBC does not produce, or Scottish Television, regular programmes, or BBC Radio Scotland does not produce regular programming in Scots. There are occasional short films produced that are by BBC Scotland. One of the great successes of MG Alba, amazingly, is the traditional music awards show every year, the Trads, and they are presented both in Gaelic and Scots. And to me, that could be a way forward. They've been a brilliant success story with a huge audience. And Scots song is obviously a great source of joy in the Scots language, and more could be done based on Scots song and traditional music. I know for a fact that even the soap opera on the BBC, River City, was watered down of its Scots content in the early days. I knew somebody who wrote for it, and they were constantly asked to remove words and to water down the Scots content. So that's a very sad thing. When the the new BBC television channel was opened, if ever there was an opportunity to produce regular programmes in Scots, that was it. I wrote to them at the time and said this is what they should do, and I was ignored. And that should be a channel which should be producing regular programmes in Scots. Apologies.
Are those music awards reaching younger people, or is it sort of old traditional?
No, traditional music is thriving. Lots of young bands. Young, sexy bands are playing great traditional music, and the kids love it and love to dance to it. And one of the glittering occasions of the year is the Trads Awards. In the last one was in Dundee, and it's a great occasion. People dress up, and there's an example of a modern audience, beautifully dressed, beautifully turned out, listening to a contemporary Scots and Gaelic programme, and just celebrating their culture. It's a wonderful thing.
Helen.
Yes, so currently across, BBC NI television, but also Radio Ulster, Radio Foyle, which is predominantly up in the northwest, and also on BBC Sounds, we have a regular half-hour programme called Kintra, 52 weeks of the year.
Is it online only then? If it's
no, that is BBC. It's on the BBC, Radio Ulster, Radio Foyle, and then for a few weeks afterwards on BBC Sounds, which is very important because you obviously very much extend your reach to an audience. We have that a big game. It's a magazine. It's changed over the years. Not so much looking back, as I was saying, but very much trying to reflect Ulster Scots communities, but also go beyond those communities to share stories. So, say, on this Sunday's programme, I was at a women's football match with this great women's team who have gone up the divisions, and they were using words without being hugely conscious of it. Come on, and they were guldering from the sidelines, get a move on, all that sort of stuff. So, it has music and stories about people and place. It's a lovely listen. That's every Sunday at 6:00. So we have those. I have to say a big game changer for us is one, we have a dedicated senior executive within the BBC, Fiona Keane, has really moved things forward. And also the same for Irish language. We have an Ulster Scots Broadcast Fund. And they have, as of January of this year, they give production companies funding support to make programmes, and they had 280 hours of television, radio, digital work across documentary, factual, history, entertainment, education for schools, animation, like the lovely Billy Connolly doing the Seamus Heaney's translation of the 5 Fables. And we still have these links, going back and forth, Billy. So there's some, this past decade we have come on so much, and it just shows how much more we can do. So we're a lot stronger than we used to be, but we could have, we could just grow and grow, couldn't we?
Mm-hmm. And I think, sorry to cut in there, but in looking at the Ulster Scots Broadcast Fund and the Irish Language Broadcast Fund too, it's not just the output, it's not just the 25 hours of original content, new content, that's not what's key, but the training schemes and the apprenticeship schemes that they offer has meant that the workforce talent has been totally expanded. So say 15 years ago it was very difficult to get an editor, for example, who spoke Irish, or a camera operator, or crew that you have working on it. It was very difficult to get that, but because of the training schemes that have been run through the Irish Language Broadcast Scheme, I'm assuming it's a similar, we now have those people that have those linguistic skills, but also have the hard skills that they need to create high quality productions. So that has been really key. One of the challenges that we have is around children's broadcasting, again, as I said, just not having the capacity to do it. So a lot of the programmes have been reversioned programmes, so maybe they originally dubbed over, they originated in French or whatever, which have their own challenges because all languages are different and the syntax is different, the number of, the way it's put together is different, so that can be quite difficult. So if there were more investment, having the ability to create original content that is specifically linguistically targeted towards those children would be phenomenal. that would be the dream. But I mean,
and in the training element, television production companies, and I don't mean to be cruel, but a decade ago they wouldn't have touched Ulster Scots with the barge pole because there was a sort of a slight cringe factor. It was too political, you know, all that sort of stuff. So in a decade, it's wonderful to see the changes that have taken place. And they have, the Ulster Scots Broadcast Fund have a trainee television production scheme. 18 months, they go straight into a television production company. That company is making programmes about Ulster Scots in all sorts of various forms. And those young people are getting hands-on experience. They are also saying to that production company, because they're drawn from Ulster Scots communities, well, this is what we do, this is what we think, this is what we think our story should be, and this is what we think it should be told. Before that, there was absolutely none of that. It just didn't really happen. So we've seen a lot of steps in the right direction, and there's, say, a lot more that could be achieved.
Laura, you mentioned Gwenno Saunders. Are you reaching a young audience, and what kind of programme?
Yeah, so earlier the BBC gentleman mentioned the 5 minutes of news that happens every Sunday. That's actually translated by volunteers because there's nobody within BBC Radio Cornwall who can do that. And there are voluntary radio and magazine programmes that are produced and distributed via YouTube. That's not funded in any way by us because of limited resources. So where Screen Cornwall, and Screen Cornwall's a pretty young screen agency, we were only formed in 2019, so we're pretty early days, but we focused very much on drama, picking up the tradition of drama short funding that came through previous iterations of the Cornish Language Office. And looking at drama helps us with transporting people into an entirely Cornish world. We don't fund period dramas. We don't look backwards at myths and legends and heritage necessarily, but we use Cornish in a way that is a contemporary world that the viewer can lose themselves in a great story. And yes, they might be reading the subtitles in English, but for all intents and purposes, that world exists entirely in Cornish. So we've taken that approach, but we are still now looking at expanding further into some documentary content, some immersive content. We're experimenting essentially with different programme calls and looking at the ecosystem that we've got, the supply chain, the skills, the training that needs to go around building a Cornish public service media in effect. So with the money that we've had through a recent devolution deal, a small amount of money, and also our local council have funded Screen Cornwall through some Shared Prosperity Fund money because they recognise the importance of investing in this early stage of a Cornish public service media where we can test and learn. And I think what's important for us is we're not necessarily seeking a channel. We're looking at platform agnostic, digital first, 21st century non-linear commissioning. So we're taking the stories to audiences rather than expecting audiences to come to us. And I think going back to your original question about audiences, not only are there the kind of speakers and learners, there's the residents of the wider community, there's the Cornish diaspora globally, and then there's the millions of people who hold Cornwall in great affection, the Cernophiles out there, and the Case for Cornish Public Service Media has estimated that addressable audience to be 25.5 million people. So we feel that the best route is to commission emerging talent in looking at contemporary issues through drama or documentary, and then taking that content to audiences where they are. We've got a month-long programme at the moment around St Piran's Day on Cornish, authentic Cornish content. That's selling out in cinemas, in sort of traditional screens, and also it's going to be put online to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the recognition of Cornish in 2014, so that will be coming out in April as a digital product through a platform that exists in Cornwall where there already is an audience.
And is Gwenno sort of one of a kind, or is there a Cornish rap scene? I mean, I know
there's loads of people making music in Cornish. Obviously Gwenno is bilingual, and that sort of that great sort of clash and celebration of different upbringings and where people get their cultural references and how that feeds into their creative work. We're also working quite closely with Brittany, so we're about to launch a co-commission for a drama short with the Breton broadcasters. So we're exploring our Celtic roots and our Celtic connections very actively, recognising that Cornwall is a relatively small nation with relatively small speaking population at the minute. Those connections and with the wider Celtic media and the connections with Celtic Media Festival are completely invaluable to us.
In France, they set quotas for music played on the radio that 15% has to be in French language. That helped French hip-hop turn into the second market share in the world after the US. Would something like that work across any of your languages? If you put actual state quotas?
I think for us, music is just one element of what the council are trying to develop as a Cornish curriculum. So going back to what people have said about starting at the early years and with children and education, through all parts of our kind of minority experience, I think needs to be reflected. So music, the references that education is using for history, using Richard Trevithick instead of another English inventor is a great way of sort of bringing the culture and heritage to light, and language goes hand in hand with that in terms of the way you can start to introduce language and make it feel relevant to people from where they live.
And we asked sort of whether we know that there's a youth audience. Do you know if there are sort of minority, I speak Bengali, that's not going to serve any purposes of this inquiry, but do we know if sort of BAME communities are getting interested in this kind of dimension as well? Is there a possibility to be a minority in all this?
Well, for example, I live across the River Tay from the city of Dundee, which has got a very thriving poetry tradition in the Dundee dialect, including people who rap in the Dundee dialect and who sing punk music in the Dundee dialect. If there was a television service in Scots, you would see more of that on television rather than just seeing young, brilliant Gaels performing in Gaelic. But because there isn't a regular Scots content, people like that tend to remain underground in their own city rather than being broadcast to the nation, if you like. Interesting, but Cornish, of course, is a Brythonic Celtic language, and people discuss what's the oldest Scottish language. Is it Gaelic or is it Scots? They both come into Scotland roughly about the same time. But the ancient language that was there in Scotland when both came in was actually Welsh, and some of the greatest early Welsh epics are set in Scotland. It strikes me that I'm the only person who hasn't used my native language so far here. Everyone has done a little bit. So 3 great lines from Hugh MacDiarmid, the father of the Scottish Renaissance, to give you a feel for the flavour of the language. First, very relevant to what we're talking about, language identity. To be yoursel and to make that worth being, nae harder job to mortals has been given. MacDiarmid on his responsibility to Scottish culture. A Scottish poet mun assume the burden of his people's doom and dee to brack their leaving tomb. And looking forward with confidence to the future. For we hae faith in Scotland's hidden poors, the present's theirs, but all the past and future's ours.
And Sarda's just had a heart attack.
Just to answer your question.
Yeah, do we know if there are minority consumers of these minorities?
There are minorities within minorities, so we are seeing with new communities coming to Northern Ireland, we are seeing people from different, bringing their own cultural experiences really into the Irish language in particular. They are small, however, and it is something that we would love to try and nurture. With the Irish language, Irish medium schools, I think we're seeing more of it because there are children coming out. They're speaking their home language, whatever that may be. They're speaking English and then they're speaking Irish as well because of their opportunities. But certainly through music, and you mentioned, Laura, the importance of music being a key to entice people into language learning. And I think, I'm not sure that I would set firm quotas on it, because I think what's nice about one of the programmes I present, which is a traditional Irish music programme, listeners will often say to me, oh, I just discovered this, musician because I was listening and I heard that gorgeous song that you played from Scotland, or and they're an English speaker who's listening, and they then access a whole other artist's content because they're listening to a programme that has a mixture of language on it. I'm not sure if you're getting minorities.
Say the programme I'm working on is more verbal, but there's always music integrated within it. I mean, obviously, things like the pipes and the lambeg drum, which is this massive, great big drum, that rattles down the street at various times of the year. So we have lots of music. We always finish our programme with a piece of music. Funnily enough, it was Gavin, the shinty player. Who's the great shinty player? He did a piece of music about shinty playing. We had that at the end of Sunday's programme past. Yes, we have, a growing diversity within Northern Ireland, which is wonderful. So one of our programmes just a few weeks ago we had an Ulster Scots Chinese fusion event. And people will go, what? But actually, obviously, there are historical links that go way back to the 1700s. The first governor of Hong Kong was from East Belfast, Pottinger, and lots of other things. So there was this fusion event, and they had their lion drum and pipes, and we had the flute and the lambeg drum, and completely, without being, orchestrated, there was like a Chinese Ulster Scots drum off. Now, it was absolutely unique to BBC Radio, but it was the most wonderful, happy event. So, and then we had Ulster Scots being translated into Chinese. Even they used the phrase, what's the crack? If you would know. I mean, that was having to be translated into Chinese. So it was terrific that we could fuse with another community like that. And I think a lot more of that could be done. Because we share a lot when you're a small ethnic community, you share a lot of experiences, and it's good. It's great.
I was just going to add that I think the thing that unites all our Celtic nations is our outward-looking perspective. So we've all got ports, we've all got shipping and marine traditions, and I think that kind of cultural richness that comes from people coming and going through the centuries really build what's possible today in terms of contemporary reflection. And I think there are other parts of England I'm sure don't have that same outward-looking focus.
But conversely, when I was little, the BBC used to have Asian language. It was in Hindi programming. Naya Zindagi, Naya Zivan. It's Googling it. It says 1968 to 1982. And then I think they realised that everyone can speak English nowadays, so those programmes went out of the system. It's interesting to see the opposite movement here, because keeping these languages alive, there wasn't David Blunkett saying everyone must learn English and all that. Anyway, my last question, just about the how you strike the balance with these programmes between someone who's still learning and the fluent speaker, and could you use your services to educate in the Duolingo kind of way?
Yeah, I think it is a challenge because they're very different target audiences, much more accessible on television because you have visual cues, you have accessibility features such as subtitling. We have found that short digital series have found really effective in that sense because they're easily consumable, they're short chunks, they're not overwhelming. I think sometimes when you sit down to watch an hour documentary, it can feel a bit overwhelming as a language learner, so that's something that can be effective. But as I said, because of limited resources, you will always have competing priorities. Another tactic we tried to use was, because we have radio content throughout the week, we've then developed a podcast which is sort of a simplified version of the highlights of the week that is broken down in an easier digested form. But you're right, the language learning since the pandemic has largely been online and Duolingo, and that's not just within the UK. If you look worldwide, the Irish language has become phenomenally successful in the United States and places like that. And I think we mentioned Caoimhe, the Oscar-winning movie earlier on, which was an Irish language production, and I think that kind of speaks to the added asset that any of these productions have when they have a minority language with them. Because there are accessibility features, they can be consumed by a larger audience. So language learners can absolutely access these services because they have subtitles, and because they're able to tap into what the essence of the programme is about.
In Scots, there's not such a problem because they're sister languages, so it's usually a matter of people tuning in, and once they're used to hearing it, being able to understand most of it from the context that it's broadcast. Scots has been eroded, but it hasn't been replaced, and when people of sister languages, similar to Catalans understanding Spanish or Dutch understanding German, most people whose native language is English, with a bit of effort, can tune into Scots and understand it, and vice versa. So there isn't the same problem with Scots. But again, I think that our linguistic ability has been eroded in the 20th century. For example, Abraham Lincoln was a great fan of Robert Burns and could quote Burns in Scots, screeds of it, because a friend of his was a Scots speaker from Ayrshire who taught him the works of Burns. That probably wouldn't happen today because people wouldn't have the linguistic confidence to do that today. So I think there's been an erosion of confidence in linguistic ability. And Britain and France, interestingly, are unique in that, where, I mean, if you spoke, say, Cornish, Welsh, Irish, Scots and Gaelic in Britain, you'd be regarded as an eccentric. You wouldn't be regarded as somebody who was educated and erudite. You'd be regarded as a total eccentric, whereas somebody who speaks, who's a monoglot, RP English speaker, is regarded as mainstream and sophisticated and at the centre of things. So it's a very different world picture that has happened in the United Kingdom because of that accident of America replacing Britain as the world power and English being so dominant in our history.
Well, Esperanto never took off, did it?
See that?
Esperanto, remember that?
I do. I was a member of the Esperanto Society at Edinburgh University.
Big fans of it.
Although conversely, regional accents have become much more common on all our broadcasting channels, and we've had we're much more accepting and welcoming of sort of diversity of regional accents. Certainly, my dad, who's from Birmingham, back in the early 70s when he was broadcasting, spoke in very sort of southern English, and I notice even his accent over the years has changed. So, yeah. Anyway, John.
But not in news. You'll never hear somebody with a strong Scouse accent reading the news. They'd never be chosen for that. The certain accents are respectable. Welsh, with Hugh Edwards. Scottish was seen as trustworthy. I mean, I always used a Scottish accent, my own accent, when I read the news. I think what you were describing, Billy, is the cultural cringe, as it's called, isn't it? Where people just, they're embarrassed about their own culture. They're being taught to be embarrassed about their own culture. I just wanted to ask you all a question, which is that we're writing a report here, and so I think what we'd like is recommendations from you. Just a one-line recommendation. We'd all like to see, I'm sure we'd all like to see all of your language. I know you would like to see all of your languages increase the numbers so that Cornwall was bilingual and Scotland and Ireland was trilingual and confidently. So it'd be good for education, learning other languages. What do you think is the key? What would you like us to put in this report that would lead to the revival that you guys want to see? Can I start with you, Laura?
I think from the Cornish perspective, it will be equity of support from government to build up both the education and the media side of our community. So very simple from where we are, improvement.
Or status?
Yeah.
Maybe a parliament might help. Billy?
Just recognition of the multilingual diversity that exists in the United Kingdom, and that these languages, like English, need status and support and cherishing and love.
Definitely the long-awaited and promised movements within government to have our language, and it goes the same as for Irish, properly represented, respected, and to have the institutions that they have promised. set up. We're sick of waiting. We want them now because that will make a huge difference.
Institutions being?
The Office of Culture and Identity and our commissioners within that. So we need that. That'll move things forward a lot. Get education, and that transfers into broadcasting. It's a two-way street.
I would echo that absolutely, Helen. For me, it looks like further investment. It also looks like increased visibility in terms of marketing. Because these programmes exist doesn't always mean that they get the marketing and the publicity that they deserve. And so I would like to see an increased awareness around that support and a celebration of the fact that we are making high quality, successful, award-winning programmes within these minority languages.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Last but not least, Clive.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask about how broadcasting has changed, particularly with the digital media? Is it that does the future of minority languages lie in digital media, in the sense that people can choose to go there when it suits them? Or do you need linear TV to actually drive forward numbers? So people are, almost, are forced to experience a language. Which is it, or is it a bit of both? Can I start with you, Billy? Oh, well, okay. Laura, yeah.
I don't think Cornish needs a linear channel. I think the kind of proportional resource that would need to, as you say, force people to into Cornish isn't the right strategy for our nation. The digital approach, I think, identity is so complex these days, and particularly that younger generation. They are defining themselves and where they want to find content, and they will seek it out, or they will go to platforms that they know will serve content that they like and appreciate and will share. So my view is that the digital aspect of taking content out to people and finding those beautiful niches where Cornish comes together with another form of identity. So we've got one LGBTQ short film that we commissioned, which has done incredibly well selling internationally onto SVOD platforms, because the story connects with an audience because of the multiple themes of identity. It just happens to be in Cornish, but it's a great story. So for me, it's taking that approach of looking for the connections between story and audience and identity, and then putting the content where those...
Yeah, I was going to be my next question to you, actually, is how you decide on that content, because if you're... how you decide what will attract people to what you produce.
Well, we run all our commissioning through open calls because of where we are in our journey towards being a public service media. So we don't necessarily have a big commissioning team. We don't have a lot of resource to nurture relationships with talent in that way. So we run open calls. We evaluate scripts in English. We don't expect people to be fluent Cornish speakers to apply to us. And then a lot of support is given to those people who want to tell authentic stories from their experiences. They can tell them in a meaningful way. They have the skills around, the filmmaking skills around the storytelling skills to pull it off. We then support them with the Cornish language elements. So we translate, the scripts are translated by the Cornish Language Office. Voice notes are recorded about pronunciation for the actors and the director to use. And the Cornish Language Office and us are involved at every stage of the production. So we probably do it slightly a different way around to other parts of the UK, but that actually builds capacity and talent, and there's a lot of people interested in working in Caoimhe, as well as English in the region.
And what's been your experience? Because you're sort of very much in the sort of embryonic stage from, we've been with Welsh, where we are with Gaelic, and where we are with Scots, and they've got a longer history, let's say, than Cornish. So what's been the reaction of people in Cornwall as you've gained more traction, more reach? Just about, are they talking about their respecting their identity more? What's the sort of response you get to what you've produced and their experience?
Well, I think we're still quite an early stage relatively to engaging the public, and our Shared Prosperity Fund project is very much about kind of building audience, and these sold out screenings that we've got this month, for example, are sort of an early stage indication of how much appetite there is. But I think there's loads more we can do, and getting beyond the kind of Cornish resident population to the global diaspora is really important, because we know from previous films that have been made by Cornish filmmakers, that there is a really big audience in that sort of wider world.
Okay, and Billy, is digital the future for Scots?
I think it will be, but for my generation, I think there still is a status that comes from seeing your language produced on the major television services. We mentioned the news in Scots. I mean, a natural would be the weather in Scots, because you can almost not describe the Scottish weather without words like drich, druche, etc., etc. So it would be good just to see that for the status of older speakers, who still are the ones who've got the treasure trove of the language. I myself was the last of the pre-television generations, born in the early 1950s. So our treasure trove of Scots vocabulary is huge, and we still could provide rich programming in Scots. But for the younger generation, definitely digital is the way to go. And there is a thriving Scots language culture, as I say, through music and poetry and plays, etc., that's there to be tapped into. But we need recognition, and we need to be given a platform on the major channels of the United Kingdom.
Eva, Helen, do you have anything to add to that?
I would say that Ulster Scots broadcasting for a long time, and still say our radio is set quietly at 6 p.m. on a Sunday evening, so that it has a few weeks on BBC Sounds is great, because you'll have a wider reach of an audience. But it definitely seen as television programmes have been made, and they are creating beautiful programmes which people across the whole of Ulster will enjoy. You don't have to be an Ulster Scots to enjoy our programme or the things that we're seeing. Series like The Band, about the life of the pipe bands, Family Footsteps, and particularly The Hamley Kitchen, which is presented by Paula McIntyre, who's become something of an Ulster Scots icon at the minute. She's wonderful. And so that has got onto mainstream BBC Northern Ireland television. You wouldn't have had that. Any wonderful documentaries that were made were always at 10:30. You know, folk were going to bed. So it is wonderful to see a little bit coming onto mainstream. And within the Ulster Scots Broadcast Fund, they are producing a lot of material devoted to language, storytelling and so forth, which has a digital presence. But I sometimes I don't quite understand is how different digital is. Is that you bring onto your social media? Is that what you mean by digital? What?
Well, I mean, my original question was about the difference between digital and linear TV. So is it necessary to have linear TV to drive forward the numbers, or is it about going digital when people can choose to look, to listen or view whenever it suits them?
You need both, because one can work for t'other.
Yeah, I agree. I think it needs to be both. I think when you look at people's habits and how they consume media, it's usually within a domestic setting. It's usually with their family. They're usually sitting on their sofa. You only need to watch Gogglebox to see how we all consume TV. So I think having that status of having your slot, right, this is the Irish language slot, and we know what we're going to expect, is hugely important. Also, over the last few years, we've managed to put in some Irish language continuity announcements before the programmes come on, which has been really welcomed by the community, because they now feel that, oh, here comes my programme, and it's not being announced in English anymore. Obviously, we are working within a digital-first strategy, which has meant that many of our new series appear as a digital drop on iPlayer. So whilst they are broadcast linear, they are also... You might get, it's a 4-part series, you can now watch them all and binge them to your heart's content on iPlayer, which I think has been really good in terms of increasing reach and keeping people clued in, particularly the younger audiences. And also it has allowed that content to be embedded alongside mainstream content within the iPlayer. So we don't have a drop-down Irish language section, if you like, where all the programmes live. They are alongside, if you search drama, they're alongside the English medium drama as well. And I think that has been really important in terms of increasing awareness and giving it that status that it's featured. And also on the digital rails, if we're publicising or we're pushing a particular programme on the local rail, which is what's happening in your area or Northern Ireland in this case, to see an Irish language programme feature alongside English language programmes has been really a huge lift to promote the programmes that we're making. So I think you need both. I don't think that one can exist without the other, to be honest.
And finally, for me, do you want to tell us a bit about Film K and the Cornish filmmaking? Anything you want to add? Because you have mentioned it already.
Yes, I think the short film drama we talked about was running from 2003, and then there was a pause and it was revitalised in 2018. I think what's interesting for us, and it's hearing colleagues today talk about the importance of prominence and support from BBC iPlayer. We always had an ambition that the quality level of our content that was being produced locally with local funding would work on those national platforms, and I think we made a good start by getting 4 shorts on the iPlayer. It took probably 2 years to persuade the BBC to list those, and we've not yet had any success with getting them to list any more. So I hope that wasn't just a one-off tick box exercise to keep Cornish people happy, but I think the short form content, in terms of audience behaviour and the way people consume, is a really great place to start for an earlier stage public service media like ours, because it gives people a chance to dip in and get lost in a story world and then go and find more.
So my last question was going to be about ambition. You mentioned ambition was to get it on BBC iPlayer platform. You succeeded in doing that. So and you want more. Is there any other ambitions that you have for Film K?
I think Film K is just part of the wider ambition we have for a Cornish public service media. So we'd like to see programming across all genres. We'd love to see a magazine show, news and sport, and weather, as these guys have described, works well in their own communities. So I think for us we're very, very early stage, but the ambition is to be treated equitably, to reflect our communities and be seen within the large presence that is in England as something separate and distinct.
And you're not going to go away?
Probably not.
Very good. Thank you very much, Clive. Everybody, can I thank you all very much for your evidence today? It's been absolutely fascinating and whistle-stop tour of the diversity of the British Isles. It's really great to hear from you all. Thank you so much indeed. If you have anything that you were desperate to say that we didn't get to, please do feel free to drop us a line afterwards and we'll add it to our inquiry. But in the meantime, thank you all very much for coming along and joining us. Order.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.